Hello, everyone. Welcome to Demo²cracy. I'm your host, Thomas Liu, and I'm stuck at home feeling bored out from 15 hours in front of the screen every day. Now, before we get started, hit that like button, subscribe, and share. And today we have a very special guest for our very first interview on this show. Milo Hsieh, a graduate from American University with BA in International Studies, now a DC-based policy professional focusing on Taiwan policy and US-Taiwan relations, and a friend of mine from high school, will be joining us today from Washington, D.C. with the latest update on Taiwan-US relations and Asian politics in the United States. Without further ado, let's get right into the show. Hello, Milo.
Hello, Thomas. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm fine, thank you. Can you start by giving us the latest update on US-Taiwan China relation?
Yeah, so right now in DC, there's not much exactly going on, but with the change of administration between the Trump administration and the Biden administration, you're seeing a lot of different policies being reconsidered. So while under the Trump administration, there has been this sort of strong on China take, especially with past officials like Mike Pompeo and National Security Advisor John Bolton. There's been a lot of sort of strong policy towards China. Also, a lot of sanctions going on against Chinese companies like Huawei and other sort of lots of economic actions and competition between US and China. But I think with the new administration, as you know, in last November, the Biden administration was elected, and in January of this year, they were inaugurated. So right now, I think what I'm seeing right now is as the Biden administration sort of comes in after one term of the Trump administration, it's trying to reconsider what sort of policy is it going to continue from the Biden administration and what sort of policy or attitude it's going to sort of change. In my opinion, the Biden administration is I don't think, even though in Taiwan, many think that the Trump administration was a much more pro-Taiwan administration, I think the Biden administration has also continued a lot of the policies. Like, for example, last year towards the Mike Pompeo, towards the end of the term of the Trump presidency, announced that he's going to lift State Department's internal diplomatic guidelines on high-level travels. This is something that was passed earlier in the Trump administration through the Taiwan Travel Act, when the U.S. Congress directed the State Department to allow high-level visits that was not previously available between U.S. and Taiwan officials. So right now, what I'm seeing is that I believe that the Biden administration is as strongly supportive of Taiwan by continuing sort of implementing these policies. But I think at the same time, there's a lot of attitudes that have shifted. For example, the Biden administration, I do not believe is as strong on countering China fully. Like, for example, on topics like climate change and other areas of cooperation like nuclear cooperation. The US, I think, has returned to a stage where it is starting to once again find ways to cooperate with China. And on these topics, it's something that Taiwan could also be involved in. But I think the US has taken a step back from the extremely strong policy on China and is now taking a more balanced and more multilateral approach.
Okay, so the Biden administration and Trump's administration's difference are mainly on their China policy, and they seem to have a policy continuity with Taiwan. Did I take that correctly?
Yes, but also I think you need to consider that U.S. foreign policy on Taiwan as well as the rest of the world is very together. So there's also a lot of other differences. Like, for example, the Trump administration was extremely strong on other issues like North Korea, like Iran as well. So you can see that the Democrats, with the Biden administration, might be shifting a little, taking a step back from its extremely hawkish policy. The same apply on issues like Israel, on Russia as well, where you see that the Trump administration took an extremely pro-Israel position. And now with one of the ongoing topic in the Biden administration right now is to resolve the Israel-Palestine issue more peacefully. So I think you not only have to look at Taiwan and China and the US relations towards them, but also sort of the big picture of what the Biden administration is trying to accomplish. And I think a central point to that is cooperating with US allies. There's a saying that the Trump administration has eroded America's influence amongst its allies. It's very strong on making the EU pay for its, making the EU countries, member states, raise its defense budget. I don't think that's something that the Biden administration would push as strongly on. So, as a whole package, you see that the US is trying to reconnect with actors both in and out of the Indo-Pacific region. And what does this mean for China and Taiwan? I think it'll take a little longer for us to see. But I definitely do think that the Biden administration is still very strongly supportive of Taiwan, especially given its democratic values and our advances in civil rights and other sort of things that aligns us with values in the US.
Okay, a statement by US National Security Advisor Jack Sullivan earlier this year said that the Biden administration will approach Taiwan issue with steadiness and clarity and resolve, prompting discussion again about the issue of strategic clarity as a shift from the strategic ambiguity that defined the Taiwan-US relation for the past 40 years. Yet, Kurt Campbell, US policy coordinator for the Indo-Pacific, said the strategic clarity carries significant downsides. In Taiwan, advocates of strategic clarity believe that it sends a stronger message to Beijing about the US's commitment to the region, while critics claim that it will embolden its pro-independence rhetoric and destabilizes the political situation. What is your take on that?
So I think to answer this question, we sort of have to go back to the origin of strategic ambiguity. So strategic ambiguity was come up after the end of the US-ROC relations and the start of US-Taiwan relations. So in during the 1970s, as you know, we have visits to China by Secretary of State, then National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, and later by President Nixon, and that led to the start of US-China relations, where the US recognized China. And since China was really strong on its one China principle, its one China position, it's sort of the precondition to US-China relations was that the US could no longer recognize Taipei as the rightful representative of China. But I think with this opportunity in 1979, when the Carter administration formally recognized China, the US government has also started the relations with Taiwan through the Taiwan Relations Act. And then through the 3 communiques and the following 6 assurances by President Reagan, the US has sort of set up a foreign policy attitude towards Taiwan as a sort of informal guarantee. Before the start of US-Taiwan relations, security of Taiwan was guaranteed under the US ROC Mutual Defense Treaty. But after the Taiwan Relations Act was signed, the US guarantee for Taiwan security is now informal rather than formal. Of course, through the 6 assurances, the US has laid out several guidelines initially in 1982 towards the ROC government, not ROC government, to the Taiwan government that was ruled under the Chen Jingguo and the KMT leadership back then. So that 6 assurances was actually not publicized until last year in 2020, and it was not formally put into words sort of until 2021 National Defense Authorization Act. So you see that right now under the current laws and the executive and what the attitudes that previous executive administrations have taken, the U.S. commitment to Taiwan remains very informal because the U.S. Is still maintaining a robust relationship with China, a robust and official relationship with China, whereas the relations with Taiwan is unofficial, maintained through the American Institute in Taiwan in Taipei, and through the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office in D.C. So right now you have a sort of informal relations with informal security guarantee. This is very different from U.S. relations with countries like South Korea, with countries like Japan, where security guarantee is sort of normal and there are military bases. And if these countries are attacked, the U.S. will come to help according to the terms of these treaties. It's not the same with Taiwan. And sort of even though the U.S. has been a very strong supporter of Taiwan security by constantly selling it new arms, ammunition, and other equipment needed for Taiwan to maintain its defense. No one can be sure whether the U.S. will come to Taiwan's aid if Taiwan, if the People's Liberation Army is to launch an attack on Taiwan in the next years or even tomorrow. So that is the main sort of central tenet to strategic ambiguity, is that there's no red line for the U.S. And this is a concern because under Xi Jinping, China and the Chinese Communist Party has constantly sent PLA jets to surround Taiwan, to go into its air defense identification zone. So a lot of proponents are advocating that the U.S. now shift to strategic clarity, which is sort of U.S. would draw its red line and tell China what it can and cannot do on Taiwan security. In my opinion, strategic clarity is a necessary step up from the current state of strategic ambiguity. As you've seen through sort of the past years, or even just the past few months, Beijing has been attempting a lot of hostile actions towards Taiwan, especially after the DPP president, Tsai Ing-wen, has been elected. So I do not believe that it's fair, sort of, for two countries, Taiwan and China, these two countries or political entity, or however you believe you want it to be, to sort of have that unhealthy relationship. Beijing has always attempted to influence Taiwan's politics through a range of means like United Front activity, election influences. And I think just last week, a think tank, a research organization called the Double Think Lab, released a report on how China has been behind much of the social media influence activity on Taiwan. So China is using all of these sort of clandestine, sort of hidden, subtle ways, as well as all overt ways, like military activity to coerce Taiwan. I think it is now time for the U.S. to review its policy, because strategic ambiguity is now over 40 years old. Does it really fit in with the current status quo of the relations between Taipei and Beijing? I don't think so. So I think now it's a time for the policy community in DC to think of ways to sort of update this outdated strategic ambiguity doctrine and move towards a strategic clarity mindset, and also put that into sort of formalized policy. How this is going to happen, I'm not sure. But I do know that different parts of the U.S. government, like Congress, like White House, the Department of Defense, the Department of State, each of these sort of bureaucracy / branches of the U.S. government can take a proactive role. So I think in the coming months, this has been sort of a point of debate by different members of the policy community, and I think this will be an ongoing process, sort of as the U.S. changes the way it looks at China.
Okay, going a bit down on the U.S. strategy view of Taiwan, do you think the U.S. will come to Taiwan's help in the event of a PLA attack on Taiwan?
Yeah, so I think first of all, we need to note that a PLA attack on Taiwan is extremely difficult. Currently, Taiwan still has a very robust defense. Taiwan still has a relatively large military reserve in addition to a standing military. Despite the fact that its reserve force is not that well maintained. And Taiwan also has a strong Coast Guard, a Navy, as well as an Air Force with cutting-edge American arms like the F-16, as well as its indigenous defense fighter. But despite China's military presence is overwhelming. It's extremely strong, and it outnumbers Taiwan's military by a lot. So in case of a military attack, if it happens in the next years, it's going to be a brutal one. A lot of people is going to die. And so you look at this situation, and so the context of a US intervention is that sort of if Taiwan does not receive any aid, any ammunition packages, or any help from its partners like Japan, like the US, then it's very easy for Taiwan to lose that battle and to eventually fall under China's control. Of course, this is not something that US and its allies wants to see. If Taiwan falls under the hand of the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Republic of China, then it's going to become a major, major strategic asset. The China is going to have access to the Pacific Ocean, and it's going to be able to project its military presence throughout the entirety of the Pacific. And this sort of branches out to influence a lot of US allies like Thailand, like Australia, New Zealand, and all of these US partners. So when you look at this, there's a lot of incentives for the US to respond, even US allies on their own, like Australia and Japan. So when you take a step back and you look at this sort of grand strategy situation, there's too much for the US to lose, but at the same time, there's no formal military commitment. And so, this is the essence of strategic ambiguity. It's scary for Taiwan because it doesn't know, if China attacks tomorrow, what's going to happen. So, and this is, I guess, something that a lot of people in the China/Taiwan community are working on. We sort of need something to replace that sort of uncertainty, because that sort of uncertainty is giving way for China to coerce and to intimidate Taiwan.
Yeah, you said that there are a lot of incentives, and they are actually quite strong for the United States government. But are these incentives strong enough that the US are willing to commit their own military to a possible future conflict? I mean, public sentiments for war in the United States is pretty strong for the past decade.
Yeah. So I think you have to sort of think about there's going to be a lot of factors, and the public opinion in the US is always going to be changing. And so in the US, obviously the president is also the commander-in-chief of the US Armed Forces. And so it would depend, whoever's in the White House, it would depend on sort of what the public is thinking, what context, if in the hypothetical scenario of a Chinese invasion on Taiwan, is the US going to respond? The US is, I believe that the US is actually quite prepared, and it's sort of thought these scenarios through. So the Department of Defense actually releases an annual report on Taiwan, and not on Taiwan, on China, on China's military power. And one of the consideration that it has is the 6 scenarios which Taiwan could be attacked. And so it's sort of considered that, okay, these are the scenarios. Well, what can the US military do / what are the risks for the US military throughout the years? increasingly over the years, it is becoming more and more dangerous for the U.S. to intervene in a hypothetical U.S.-China conflict, not U.S.-China, Taiwan-China conflict, because China has been developing its missile capability. It's been trying to strengthen and modernize its Navy. As you see, it's trying to make aircraft carriers and project its power. But I think right now the U.S. military is still quite overwhelming. It has a lot more military assets, although it's spread out around the world. So that's another consideration. And then so under all of these contexts, then falls under sort of you'll have to, the U.S. Washington D.C. is going to have to consider all these factors as it evaluates whether it will aid Taiwan in a hypothetical military attack. So I think no one can really be sure, and that's the discussion we're having today. It's something that is sort of anxiety-inducing, for everyone, for Taiwan, for Taipei, for people in D.C. working on Taiwan policy. Yeah.
So in 2019, the U.S. Congress passed the Taipei Act, and there's a clause in it that says that it should be the policy of the United States to advocate as appropriate for Taiwan's membership in all international organizations in which statehood is not a requirement. So, looking at this act, the U.S. should be helping Taiwan in joining in international organizations or multilateral agreements, right? But Taiwan still hasn't been able to participate in the WHA or ICAO, and discussions on the CPTPP has also been stalled. So that raises doubts. Is the U.S. really doing something? Is the United States really living up to the commitment that it has promised? What do you think?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think first of all, sort of have to clarify what it means when the U.S. government, specifically the U.S. Congress, passes laws like these. So as early as sort of the 2000s, the U.S. has been really pushing for Taiwan's participation in these international organizations. And also, it's been sort of pushing that for Taiwan to participate in these organizations under a name that it wants, sort of not Chinese Taipei, not Taiwan China, but Taiwan or Taiwan RLC or anything of the sort. That shows that Taiwan is a separate political entity, if not a separate country from China. So under this context, so there's that one context. And also, it's clear we need to note that as the U.S. Congress passes these laws, it's merely reflecting on the sense of Congress. So which means that the Congress is making a statement and sort of directing the U.S. government, which is the executive, who executes these sort of directions of the U.S. government. And so looking at that, so when laws like Taipei Act are passed, it's sort of Congress asking the executive to help Taiwan participate in international organizations. And so it's up to the executive to sort of decide how it's going to do that. I think there's no doubt that the U.S. sort of State Department and other bureaucracies has been very supportive of Taiwan's participation in WHA, WHO, ICAO, and the CPTPP. But at the same time, there are a lot of limitations, which is any sort of push for Taiwan to participate in these organizations. There's going to have to be compromises because China is a major actor, and China also has a lot of allies supporting it, sort of. So the question now becomes sort of, if the U.S. wants to raise its concern that Taiwan is not a part of these organizations, how is the rest of the international community going to respond? And sort of the chances is that it might actually, if the U.S. actually pushes so hard, it might actually just end up wasting the time of itself and its allies, because China is there, and China does not want Taiwan to participate in any of these international organizations. CPTPP is a little different because the U.S. under the Trump administration has actually withdrew from the TPP, and so now Japan is taking a lead on CPTPP, and then so Taiwan joining CPTPP is actually now more U.S.-Japan relations, not U.S.-Japan relations, Taiwan-Japan relations. So that's a whole nother sort of topic that you might have to ask someone in Taipei or Tokyo to answer that. But on WHO, WHA, and ICAO, I think I can talk a little bit more about that. So last year, actually, there was a case of a discourse on ICAO, which was when a lot of people were talking were on Twitter, sort of calling ICAO out for blocking Taiwan. And the social media management team managing ICAO's social media account just blocked sort of anyone who would mention Taiwan. And that is sort of discouraging and also tells a lot about the way it operates. Even if you can't even talk about, Taiwan being unfairly rejected from an organization that is relatively non-political, like on international aviation, then what sort of other, it really shows how little space Taiwan has to join these organizations. And so, yes, the US Congress, I think, is really helpful as it expresses the sense of Congress in pushing for Taiwan's participation in these international organizations. China is still a very, very big blocker, stopping Taiwan from participating in these international organizations, rightfully under the name of Taiwan. And others might disagree and say that Taiwan should participate under names like Chinese Taipei, but I don't agree. I think Taiwan should be able to participate under these organizations under Taiwan. And whether statehood is required or not, I think, of course, other organizations like the World Trade Organization, Taiwan is able to enter and participate as a member. But it's always sort of had to join under a less than favorable name. So I think in that, the US, Taiwan would really have to balance sort of its fight to enter these organizations. Does it have to sacrifice anything? And are these sacrifices on paper, like on names, acceptable to people in Taiwan? My opinion and my observation is that it's less and less acceptable for Taiwan to join these international organizations under a less than favorable name. And so the US is sort of also helping Taiwan push for that. But right now, it's a very sad status quo we're having where Taiwan just isn't able to join under Taiwan. And the US, as much as it can help, always has a blocker there. So one can say that, I'm sure a lot of people would believe that the US is not sort of, a lot of people in Taiwan, I would imagine, think that the US has been saying a lot, but not doing little. My belief is that the US has been saying a lot, and that is a positive sign. We need to keep the US government and Congress supportive of that ideal that Taiwan should participate. But we also have to be very, very cognizant of all the roadblock and the limitation that the US government can do, especially the US Congress.
We'll get to US Congress and US politics later, but before that, there's a further question we have regarding to vaccine. So according to NBC News, half of US adults are now fully vaccinated. From what we're seeing in reports, the United States still have some 500 million to 1 billion vaccines, but either selling to Taiwan directly or through COVAX, we haven't seen any vaccines coming to Taiwan from the US. Taipei Mayor Cohen just said on May 19th that, and I quote, "The US didn't sell a single dose of vaccine to Taiwan." It's not as if we're doubting Taiwan's relation, but actions speak, and these news are certainly raising questions, and these questions are being raised by very well-known politicians in Taiwan. So, what do you think?
Mm-hmm. So, I think the opinions of politicians like Mayor Ko is definitely valid, and I would understand why he would think that way. But I think it's also we need to be very, we need to know that every sort of, the role of every government in the world is to safeguard the safety of its own citizens first. And then so some people might say 50% of the US are not vaccinated. And some people might say it's great that 50% are already vaccinated. You know, it's kind of like, is my glass half full or half empty? And sort of to reach herd immunity, and correct me if I'm wrong because I'm not a medical expert, but the US government has been pushing really, really hard for people to be vaccinated. And you can see this in sort of states like New York, like Maryland, where they're bringing lotteries for the vaccinated people to encourage people to get vaccinated. One thing to note is that in the US, there's a very, very strong skepticism towards vaccines. You know, people are choosing not to get vaccinated because they don't trust the government or because they don't trust the vaccine or for whatever reason. And then so the government, US government has to make sure these people come out and get vaccinated or else they're a COVID risk. And then so the US government still actually, you know, I don't think it's fair to say that the US is done with its vaccination yet. So that's why, you know, sort of as the US is helping other countries acquire vaccines, it also has to mind its own sort of security interest, the public health interest by saving up enough vaccines. On the point that the US, you know, on the saying that the US is not helping Taiwan enough, I don't think it's necessarily fair. The US is a huge producer of these vaccines. And then so when Taiwan is sort of not capable of producing these vaccines on its own yet for public use, I think it's something that Taiwan should also consider by itself. You know, Taiwan doesn't really have a very strong like biomedical, like medical manufacturing capability because of the way its healthcare, its price control is structured. So when Taiwan does not have its own domestic vaccine production capability, I think it might be a little unfair for politicians to say that, hey, the US government is not helping us. Like the US government sort of has to safeguard the rights of its own citizens first before it could help Taiwan. And the US government has also been sending vaccines to schemes like COVAX. So it has been helping its allies sort of through these schemes to help less countries that cannot acquire vaccines as easily, like Taiwan, acquire vaccines. And Taiwan has been receiving vaccines from COVAX. So can you really, you know, that Taiwan has indirectly been helped by these more developed countries who have contributed to COVAX. So yeah, I think the lines are a little blurred. One cannot be, you know, as direct and to cast doubt on US support for Taiwan based on vaccines. I think in the past week, the Biden administration has also announced that it is going to send more vaccines to its Asian, to countries of Asia that are partners of the US, and also contribute more to COVAX. So I think these are positive signs that Taiwan would definitely benefit from.
Okay, we'll take a break and come back later.
Yeah, sure.
We were talking about the U.S. Congress, and Taiwan's diplomatic department has always lobbied U.S. congressmen. The policy actually started since the time of President Lee. So actually, there has been about 20-year history for this diplomatic effort. What do you think about lobbying congressmen instead of going through the traditional diplomatic routes like the AIT or State Department?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think I'll speak on this more generally since I haven't been in DC for that many years. I've only been here for 4 years instead of 20. So I can speak on what I've seen throughout these years that I'm here. So I think, so let's start from AIT and TechRo. These organizations are actually still not official representatives of governments. So in the AIT, it's a nonprofit organization based in Arlington. The AIT office is in a building that's actually not in DC. And in Taiwan, it's also, although it conducts official embassy business, it still does not actually sort of formally act as an embassy. And in DC, TechRo, the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office, which is a de facto embassy of Taiwan, is not formally designated as an embassy. It's still a nonprofit organization. So sort of the formal framework for these organizations means that there's a lot of limitations to what they could do in terms of lobbying each other. And so for Taiwan, the limitations for TechRo is that, it's a consulate. It's for, overseas citizens of Taiwan to apply for visas and things like that, but also sort of maintain unofficial relations. So since the relation is already unofficial, it might be more effective to, and since TechRo, interacts mostly with its State Department counterparts, it means that the only sort of organization TechRo can formally or informally lobby is a bureaucracy, is the US Foreign Service. And, as you know, the policy decisions are not formulated by executive organizations. Executive are not, sorry, let me rephrase that. In the US, decisions are passed by US Congress and they are implemented by the executive. And so the State Department is under the executive branch. So, and it doesn't sort of have its own power to formulate policy. So if TechRo wants the State Department or the US government to do something, it's more effective to directly hit the people who are making these policies. And that means lobbying the US Congress. So the US Congress has actually been sort of the most active supporter of Taiwan in some areas, because, the executive and the White House has to take care of US relations with everyone, while Congress are consisted of individual congressmen, senators, who, might have varying degrees of interest in topics. So a lot of times, pro-Taiwan legislations are pushed by specific congressmen and specific senators with who are really working on the Taiwan issues. Like, for example, over the past few years, Senator Cory Gardner, who has visited Taiwan a couple of times, has been a very strong supporter of pro-Taiwan legislation, and he actually is a sponsor for them. And as well as other people in the House of Representatives, like Representative Steve Chabot, and a lot of congressmen and senators from both political parties are very supportive of Taiwan. And the two are just examples that I've raised. So the significance of influencing the US Congress is that you're influencing the decision-making body of the US government. And, it's always good to, it becomes the most effective if you can influence the bureaucracies, the people executing these policies, and the people making these policies at the same time.
Okay, but Qian Fu, who is a former Minister of Affairs for ROC or Taiwan, wrote in his memorandum that when the Lee government decided to lobby congressmen back in the 1990s, actually sparked a lot of protests from the State Department because they feel like Taiwan is trying to pressure them through Congress, and that made Taiwan's U.S. relation, or at least our relations in the public diplomatic domain, kind of tense. So, what do you think about this history?
I think, of course, you know, wait, I can hear myself. Hello. Okay, it's better now. Okay. So I think obviously, as per any bureaucracies, you know, bureaucrats might not necessarily like changes, and a lot of you have to look at the people in the U.S. Foreign Service. You know, the Foreign Service officers sort of are there to implement policies, and of course, you know, keeping things as it is, keeping relationships as it is without changing too much, because that changes the content of their work. And you know, I would assume that people don't like it when they have to consistently change the policy objectives they're pushing for. And so I would understand, you know, if that part of history is true. But I think it's also normal, you know, that these bureaucracies and bureaucrats feel pressured and don't like that. But in the US, it's very normal for foreign governments to lobby the US government through a variety of ways. You know, you have think tanks, you have lobbyists, and you have different offices. You know, in DC, there is, besides TechRo, there is a representative office for the Democratic Progressive Party. There are various think tanks pushing for Taiwan, and there's a lot of lobbying firms working as agents for these governments and actors. So, and yeah, the U.S. has an act called the Foreign Agent Registration Act, FARA, that regulates all of these activities. So, you know, I mean, I don't think Mr. Chen's what he wrote is something that is necessarily concerning. You know, it's just a normal part of the process in U.S. political process. Yeah.
So recently there are several assaults on Asian Americans, and there is a saying that these hate crimes are fueled by usages of phrases like Chinese virus or Kung flu, and Trump's link of the pandemic to the Chinese and Asian society. And what do you think about the people that are saying this?
So I think I'll speak a little more anecdotally on this from first. So one of the very interesting concepts to me upon arriving in the US is the use of the phrase Asian. It's sort of, you know, in actual Asia, we like to call ourselves by the countries, or more specifically, like the ethnicities of the countries that we come from, like Taiwanese, Japanese, Korean. You know, in Taiwan, there's even distinctions between like Hakka, Holo, Waisheng, Aboriginals, you know, these subgroups. But in the US, we're all the same, Asians. And it's a foreign concept to me, but it's interesting. And I think this sort of, yes, the Trump administration and Trump himself has said a lot of things and used a lot of rhetorics that are hostile towards the Asian community. It is definitely not fair for COVID-19 to be attributed as Chinese virus, because although it comes from China, when you say Chinese virus, when you say Kung flu even, this is linking the people of China and the Chinese people with the virus, and that's not okay. Because when people hear that message, they are linking, you know, Chinese people and being sick. You know, like the concept that like people of Chinese origin have brought this virus to the US. That's sort of not okay. And another thing I've observed is that in the US, there's really no distinction between different cultures and different origins of Asia, national origins of Asia. You know, when people look at me, they don't say, oh, you're from Taiwan, or you're from China, or you're from Japan. They look at me and say, oh, you're Asian, you know, because of my skin color. And to, you know, when you combine the two, these anti-Asian rhetorics really sort of puts everyone who identify as or is considered Asian at risk of these violent attacks. To go back a little further, all of these assaults are extremely disheartening for people like me. I think of questions like, should I get a bear spray, a pepper spray, and take them out? You know, I live in a relatively safer part of town, but I know a lot of people are considering these options. They have to be afraid when they go out. This is, you know, in the US, racism is still a very big topic of debate, and I don't believe anyone should be put through these sort of treatments. And there was also that shooting in Atlanta, Georgia, where a white man took a gun, walked into a massage parlor and shot up Asian woman. And well, not everyone was an Asian woman, but a majority of them were. And so something like this is extremely disheartening to see, but also it's not limited. This attitude and hostility and racism towards Asians is not limited to what Trump said. It's a very deep-rooted issues where, in my opinion, is caused by a lack of things like Asian representatives in pop culture of America. You know, there is a widespread view of this fetishization of Asian women. You know, Asians are seen as exotic, and Asian men are seen as like all sorts of things. And, you know, it's really weird when, as a person, I guess I'm Asian and I'm in a society that looks at me like that. It's very sad.
Okay.
And
yeah. So how does the Asian community respond to the hate crimes? Are a lot of people affected by it? Can you share a bit more about your personal experience or the experiences of the friends around you?
Mm-hmm. In my area, personally, there has not been an active hate crime, but sort of, I guess, the everyday interaction that I've experienced and the people around me have experienced are more microaggressions and profiling. So microaggression is when sort of people say things about you that makes you uncomfortable, but they're very small. Things like, oh, you know, oh, you're an Asian, you're so small, your skin looks so good, or, you know, stuff like that. A few cases I've personally went through was in a class, a professor told me that, oh, since you're Asian, you must be really hardworking. And it just makes me feel weird, you know, like a white person, you know, like is not gonna get things like that, you know? So these are microaggressions are based on stereotypes, covert, like sort of subtle racism, you know, when people look at each other and come up with all sorts of assumptions and conclusions that they should not be making. And profiling is when people around you, you know, treat you differently based on your skin color or who you are. And, you know, this is a term that's been used more for the African American community, where the police, you know, are statistically more likely to pull over an African American person driving a vehicle than like a white person, a Caucasian American person. And so in the context of Asians, this becomes sort of things that are everywhere, you know. The Asian American communities are sort of, they sort of fight back at things like affirmative actions, things of the sort that in the American society, being Asian just sort of warrants being treated a little differently, being profiled at different, by different people, by different institutions. And that, I guess, is a form of racism. And, you know, these are sort of the actual ways you feel being treated differently. And it's annoying as it is sort of sad. Sometimes it makes you angry. Sometimes, you know, you don't know that, like, you know, you're like, oh, that made me uncomfortable. But maybe like a week later, then you realize, oh, wait, that was microaggression. I got profiled at this place by this person. Yeah.
Yeah, but if we are to change the environment, if we are to change the public sphere, then Asians must speak up for themselves. But are Asians well represented in American politics? Because we don't really see a lot of Asian politicians.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think it's very fair to say that Asians are not necessarily well represented at the federal level. But actually, I think if you look deeper into like the state and local government level, there are a lot. Asians are pretty well represented in the areas that they concentrate. And there are, you know, you won't necessarily see as many Asian Americans in like the US Congress, but then you'll see a significant representation of them. But even at the federal level, there are a lot of, you know, bills and acts that are passed in favor of, you know, to support the Asian American community. Like, for example, there was a law passed recently on anti-Asian American hate crime, in which, you know, they mentioned the shooting in Georgia, and they listed out, actually, they memorialized every single Asian woman who was killed in that shooting. So things like these, I think, shows that even when Asian Americans are not, you know, you might not see them as much on the federal level, they're still represented. They're still represented in terms of policy, and I think that's good. And I think that with sort of what's happened throughout the past years, there is a greater level of awareness of Asian Americans. And I think an important fact is also that there's a trend that Asian Americans are also joining sort of the film industry, becoming more represented in pop culture. People are speaking up, and that's great.
Right, and one final question. So what is your take on Andrew Yang?
That's an interesting topic. Since I can't vote here, I'm not a citizen, I won't really comment, but I can say that there are people around me, and sort of his ideas are very interesting to a lot of young people. Things like, you know, how should America change as more and more jobs are being replaced? And, you know, one of his main ideas is to hand out universal basic income and to just give cash as these freedom dividends, you know, for being American citizens, as it's harder and harder to get jobs. It's an interesting topic, and, you know, I don't know the candidate well enough to sort of give you any answers, but I think it's great that we are seeing more and more of these contenders at the highest level for Asian Americans. You know, most, you know, like the like I said in the previous question, at the top level of the U.S. government, Asian Americans are not that well represented, not that well represented as like senators or congressmen. So I think it's definitely great that we're seeing people like Andrew Yang run for offices, like, you know, right now he's running in New York. So we'll see what comes out of that. Yeah.
Okay. Right. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for your time, Milo.
No problem. Happy to help.
Yeah, very happy to have you with us today. And for Demo²cracy, our show will go up every Tuesday noon on Facebook and YouTube. So be sure to check that out and hit that like button, subscribe, and share. Right. I'm Thomas, and that's Demo²cracy for you. Right. Goodbye.